Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm an editor of Film Stories magazine.
Candyman.
And
Candyman.
a very warm welcome
Candyman.
to the Film Stories
Candyman.
podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always, absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. Now, the movies I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, an appreciation that films are made, and just me respecting the fact that they're really, really, really difficult to bring to our screens. Without further ado, I'm going to crack on then with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories, and boy, this is a bit of a troubled one. Let me play you a clip from the trailer to set it up. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
It seems to me we can't get enough of our boogeymen. What's your take on all these rumors we've been hearing about vampires?
If vampires existed, don't you think we would have found them by now? People want to be concerned. You should focus in on characters like the sociopath that we've been pursuing.
He believes that he is out there slaying monsters.
Why can't you just be nice?
Because the world isn't nice.
You're public enemy number one, Blade. We're gonna have to take on the rest of the world, too.
Don't shoot, don't shoot.
He's fought the war against darkness alone.
We use the humans to flush you out.
Until now.
Evening, ladies.
This way!
Who the hell are you people?
My name is Hannibal King, and this little hellion right here is...
Right, well, buckle up then. That was a clip from 2004's Blade Trinity, directed and written by David S Goyer and starring Wesley Snipes, Chris Christopherson, Jessica Biel, Ryan Reynolds, Parker Posey, Natasha Lyonne, Dominic Purcell and Triple H. And so, I mean, Blade 2, regarded really as the high point of the Blade cinematic saga to date, wasn't even in cinemas when New Line Cinema, the company behind the Blade movies at that stage, decided it was going to turn the franchise into a trilogy. Now, the second film would be released in March 2002, but it was 7 months before that New Line inked a new deal with screenwriter and producer David S Goyer, and part and parcel of that deal was Blade 3. So at the point that deal was announced in August of 2001, Guillermo del Toro, who'd shot the second film in Prague and was heading into post-production on it, well, that was on its way to release, and it was then that New Line decided it wanted to type Goyer, who'd penned the previous movies, for this double bill of films, and Blade 3 was going to be one of them, and in August 2001 it was confirmed Blade 3 was a thing. At this stage, Goyer was in line to write and produce the new movie, and Del Toro was the incumbent and was asked if he was interested in directing. But at this stage, he'd had a bit of a breakthrough with a passion project he'd been trying to get going, and that was a different comic book adaptation, Hellboy. And so once he got the green light to make that, he moved away from doing a third Blade movie, but the Blade film was still going because this was a point where New Line Cinema's franchises were booming. It was in preparation at this stage on a third Austin Powers movie that would become Gold member. It was also looking at making a third Rush Hour movie after the second Rush Hour movie had gone absolutely nuts at the box office. And so Blade 3 was just like one of those metaphorical, cliched, no-brainer decisions, even though it wasn't really clear who was going to be behind the camera for it. So one person who didn't think he was going to direct was David S Goyer. I mean, he told Variety that he was expecting really just to write and produce this one, because he'd had an eye on directing. And he did say, after Blade 3, I'm done writing for other directors. I've had enough frustrations over 10 years that I've realised I can do it myself. And the thing was, this wasn't just words. He could direct himself, because he'd been working on an urban drama, a very low budget film called Zigzag. And that was his break into directing. It starred John Leguizamo and Wesley Snipes and Natasha Lyonne. And he'd wrapped production on it at this stage, and Goyer was in demand as a director. I mean, he'd already enjoyed success as a screenwriter, and so at this stage he was linked with directing the movie of a Neil Gaiman short story, Murder Mysteries. He also at this stage had an option to write and direct a Marvel project. That Doctor Strange was something in basically on his docket to pursue at a point where Marvel wasn't making its own movies itself, and so it was slightly easier to get the rights to a lot of its properties. He wouldn't make Doctor Strange, of course. He wouldn't make Murder Mysteries either, although Doctor Strange did go on to have a cinematic life, as you might have noticed. And so in came a different potential director, and the person who was next in line to direct Blade 3 was Oliver Hirschbiegel. Now, he had enjoyed success with a German movie, The Experiment, at this point, and inevitably an international director having success with a film came to the attention of Hollywood, and the offers started going out to him. And amongst those offers was an invitation to meet with Goyer to talk about Blade, and this was reported in July 2002, so we're 11 months after the first announcement of the project. Now, there was no deal that was inked at this point, but a couple of factors. First of all, Hirschbiegel admitted he'd be really happy to direct the film. He was not playing down this talk whatsoever. And also, Guillermo del Toro's Blade 2 had opened by this stage to strong reviews, a general consensus that it was an upgrade on Stephen Norrington's already impressive first Blade movie. It had cost $100 million at the global box office as well. That's not a bad chunk of change for a film of its ilk at that time. But what also came up on Hirschbiegel's docket was a different project, and in the end he went with that. He would go off to make the film Downfall, and if you've not seen Downfall, you're bound to have seen an internet meme based on it, because this is the one that tells an Adolf Hitler story, and pretty much every Adolf Hitler starring social media meme you've seen has come from Downfall, from what I can work out. So the path was clearing here for Goyer to step into the director's chair and to go from a very low budget drama behind the camera in Zigzag to Blade Trinity. And so he started putting it together with that in mind. And so he started fleshing out the cast. So, I mean, already returning were Wesley Snipes, who was also serving as executive producer on this, and Chris Christopherson was going to be back as well. He brought across Natasha Lyonne from the film that he'd just been working on as well. Triple H was, I mean, he was an option that was brought to the film that Goyer wasn't in particularly certain of at first, but would be won over and impressed by. And then there was this young actor called Ryan Reynolds, who was bubbling up, far from an action star and far from the leading man that we see in movies today. And Reynolds, I mean, he signed up on the dotted line for this one, and he would have, to the point where he'd appear on the poster for this as well. He would have to do an awful lot of bulking up to be able to get in shape for the role, but he got a big breakthrough role here in taking the movie on. So alongside Ryan Reynolds, well, Ashley Scott was one person who was cited really as an option to take on a co-leading role. And there were also talk of, well, could they spin the characters off that Reynolds and Scott were playing? But in the end, it was Jessica Biel who landed the part of this one. And so we had this lead cast of Abigail Whistler as Jessica Biel, Ryan Reynolds as Hannibal King, Wesley Snipes as, of course, Blade. And so, I mean, the path was clear. This could go into production, and what could possibly go wrong? So, glad you asked. Filming on Blade Trinity, as it would become known, began on the 22nd of September 2003. Like a lot of comic book movies at this point, it was filming in Canada. And so, I mean, where to start, really? Because people have different accounts of just what happened on the set of Blade Trinity. None of them make it sound like it was a particularly happy place to be. I think the most high-profile one, the one because there were rumours, even as this was shooting, that this had been a difficult film to make. But what really blew it open was an interview that Patton Oswalt, who plays Hedges in the movie, would give to the AV Club in 2012, so many years after the eventual release of the film. And reflecting on his career, Oswald, said there's a scene where in the movie where Blade goes in and confronts this guy for harvesting humans. And he said that scene was supposed to be the whole basis of the film. Blade is fighting for the last shred of humanity, but they, and presumably it means studio executives at this point, and there were talk of a lot of studio interference on this as well because Blade had become a big deal, but they thought it was just so, I can't read that, clucking grim, so they decided just to have Blade fighting Dracula. And he said it was just one of those. It was a very troubled production. But that was not the bit that made the headlines. The bits that really spiked and became clickbait gold for months, really, was Patton Oswalt's experiences, as he told, of working with Wesley Snipes. And he alleged that Snipes just wouldn't come out of his trailer for long periods of time, that he would stay in there and would smoke something, don't know what it was, and that he was only really on set for his close-ups. Now, this was the allegation. He also alleged that Snipes got into a confrontation with David S. Goyer, who was directing his first big studio movie at this stage, and tried to strangle him. And so what happened was they had a night out, and again, this is Oswald's story, where they went out and there was a bunch of bikers at a bar, and so David Goyer apparently said to them, I'll pay for all your drinks tomorrow if you show up to the set and pretend to be my security. And according to Oswald, Wesley freaked out and went back to his trailer. And at this stage things were coming to a head. I will come to Wesley Snipes as part of the story of this shortly. And so what then happened was a meeting, apparently, between Snipes and David S. Goyer, and Snipes telling the director that he thinks he needs to quit the film. Goyer needs to quit the film, with Oswald's quote saying, Snipes said to Goyer, you're detrimental to this movie. And Goyer stood his ground. He was no shrinking violet here, and he'd earned his place on the Blade movies through his work already. And he apparently said to Snipes, why don't you quit? We've got all your close-ups and we could shoot the rest with your stand-in. And according to the AV Club article, that freaked Wesley out so much that for the rest of the production, he would only communicate with the director through post-it notes, and he would sign each post-it note, quote, from Blade. Incredible. With Snipes apparently in his trailer for long periods of this, the conversational and dialogue parts of the script, well, they had to be shot separately. And so Oswald was talking about how Ryan Reynolds would basically have to do lines for a conversation with Snipes without Snipes there. And so Reynolds would be coming up with all sorts of improvisational stuff on the spot that in the editing room would just have to be cut to a still of Snipes' face, just looking really and reacting because he wasn't part of the conversation. Now, Snipes was executive producer of this film, and it's really important to state that he has pushed back against this in a 2020 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, and he's talked there about how he was executive producer. He had an investment in this franchise. He inevitably had an investment in the franchise. He was front and centre of it. And as an executive producer, some people just wouldn't like his decisions. But specifically to the Oswald allegations, Snipes said, if I had tried to strangle David Goyer, you probably wouldn't be talking to me now. Again, going back to the interview, he says, a black guy with muscle strangling the director of a movie is going to jail. I guarantee you. Did I go to jail for strangling him? Never happened. And Snipes said this is part of the challenges that we as African Americans face here in America, these microaggressions, the presumption that one white guy can make a statement and that statement stands as true. And he asked the question, why would people believe his version's true? Because they are predisposed to believing the black guy is always the problem, and all it takes is one person, Mr. Oswald, who I really don't know. I can barely remember him on the set, but it's fascinating that his statement alone was enough to make people go, yeah, Snipes has a problem. Now, David Goyer's part of the conversation was a little more cautious, really. Certainly around the time of the making of the film, he played it down. He was a director on a press junket, and so what's he going to do? But he talked about it in 2020 as well. And Goyer's statement was this. He said, let's just say I have a tremendous respect for Wesley as an actor. He used to be a friend. We're not friends anymore. I am friends with Patton, and I've worked with Patton since, so I don't think anyone involved in that film had a good experience on that film. Certainly I didn't. I don't think anybody involved with that film is happy with the results. And Goyer's sentence is this: it was a very tortured production. And that was tallying with the stories that were coming out during the filming of it as well. And it's a shame in many ways, because Goyer was trying things really, because Blade Trinity was being made in the aftermath of the Matrix trilogy coming out, for instance, and the Matrix sequels had arrived, and he was keen to kind of skew his film a little bit away from that. So he made a conscious attempt to reduce the amount of wire-fu action sequences in this particular movie, because he thought the Matrix films had stolen the thunder there a little bit, and he didn't just want to regurgitate what they were doing. He wanted to change the look of the film a little bit, just play a little bit with tone. And he wanted a bit more practical work when it came to the action and the in-camera sequences as well. And he encouraged improvisation as well. I mean, he would tell IGN, I improvised with Patton a little. I did a lot with Parker and Ryan and John Michael Higgins. John Michael Higgins, I should note, was playing the role of Dr. Edgar Vance in the movie. And there were clearly elements of the ensemble that were getting on. And, the film was in the can. And as Goyer was saying, from the first scene, when we sat down with Dailies, New Line Cinema was loving some of the stuff that he was sending down. And filming wrapped on Blade Trinity in February 2004, slightly conflicting accounts on that, but there was nothing to suggest this one went massively over or anything like that. For all the trouble during the filming of the movie and the clear problems that it had, I mean, you make your mind up whose account you go with. It was in the can. It could go into post-production, and New Line Cinema was looking for a release at the end of 2004 for the film, and so off it went into post-production. Now, the post-production was marred to a degree by those ongoing rumours that this was a difficult shoot, and Goyer was playing it straight, but there was a lot of talk of unrest, and there was a lot of talk of studio interference on this one as well. However, Goyer fairly quickly got his cut of the film together, that he'd written this, after all, and he knew what he wanted to do with the film. He's the sole credited writer on the movie, and within a short amount of time, he had a 2.5-hour assembly cut of the movie available to show the studio. Now, under Directors Guild of America rules, a movie director has 10 weeks to put together their cut of a film to show to the studio, and the studio is not allowed to interfere with that. The director has first say, really, on what the cut of that is. Once the studio takes delivery of that first cut, then they can do what they like. But that 10 weeks is a protected period. In the case of Goyer, though, he didn't need it. He was actually showing a slimmed-down director's cut of the film after about 6 weeks and was ahead of schedule, really. And so New Line had the movie and they were looking at it, and what's more, test screenings were underway as well. That New Line started testing the movie in around the summer of 2004. The reports were arriving online. I mean, I found one at Superhero Hype website where there was one person who was really positive about it, there was one person who wasn't. I mean, they were kind of moving towards praising people like Triple H and Parker Posey, and particularly Ryan Reynolds was breaking through. There were some grumbles about whether David Goyer was the right person to handle such a big film. And in fact, there's quite an extensive report at Hunt's News where, I mean, it was around the time of the film's release, where David Goyer acknowledges that some of that there was a degree of buzz around the movie arising for some of his casting choices. I mean, he talked in an interview with the outlet about if he's going to be making a film, if he can make scripts, then I can at least be a mediocre director, he laughed. But he said, I'm excited to be directing, and he was exciting to be able to cast the film in the way that he did. And so the report says, during test screenings, opinions were mixed. On one hand, many believed that Parker Posey, known for her role in Christopher Guest films, did well in the role. On the other hand, some felt that Ryan Reynolds' style of humour was being overused. But Goyer acknowledges the fact that there was good word of mouth building off the back of some of the casting and some of the unexpected performances in it. It's worth noting too that Goyer was very hands-on on the soundtrack side of the movie, that it was he who recruited in the RZA of Wu-Tang Clan to create music for the film. And he also was, he'd enjoyed working on the special effects on this, that instead of just expanding on what they did in Blade and Blade 2, he just refined the effects slightly. One person who was impressed by that was Stephen Norrington, who viewed the film and was just like, why didn't I think of some of the stuff you were doing effects-wise in my my version of it. It's worth noting as well that Goyer was in conversation with Guillermo del Toro, so there was no animosity between the three different directors of the films. And so all it needed now was to go before critics and then go before audiences. It's worth noting, just before we get to that bit, that Goyer was he downplayed any chance of a Blade 4 before the movie debuted and premiered. He said certainly that he wasn't involved in it. He'd been involved in the Blade franchise to this stage, but for 6 years of his life. But there was optimism heading into the release of the film, which is easy to overlook given quite how things turned out. Because the first sign things weren't going to plan was when it went before critics. But, critics and comic book movies and superhero films, they don't always get on. And some people went for it, but the majority really weren't bowled over by Blade Trinity. In particular, feeling it was a backward step to what Stephen Norrington and Guillermo del Toro in particular had done. And so the initial reaction was not strong, but still it went before audiences and it got an opening weekend of December the 8th to the 10th in the US of $16 million. The problem for New Line Cinema was that Blade 2 had opened with $32 million on its way to $155 million worldwide. Blade Trinity its worldwide total actually wasn't far from that in the end, but its opening weekend was damp. That much was clear. Now, it opened against tough competition. Ocean's 12 was the other big competitor that weekend, and that was number one slot, 39.1 million. Blade Trinity in second place was 16.1. Nicolas Cage in National Treasure was in third place a month after its release, and that was still bumbling around the chart. Other films in and around, look at the kind of competition it was against. It was The Polar Express, Christmas with the Cranks, The Incredibles, the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. There's very little, inverted commas, adult stuff. There was Oliver Stone's Alexander, there was Closer, there was Finding Neverland, but Blade Trinity was the only one really in its genre of its ilk that it was up against. It was just, there were some very big movies around, and it was a point where lots of family films were drawing audiences. That was doubly proven the following week when Lemony Snicket, A Series of Unfortunate Events, opened with $30 million, and Blade Trinity lost 60% of its business 1 week on. And the thing is, it never really recovered it. But within 3 weeks, it was out of the top 10 as films like Meet the Fockers, Fat Albert. What was that? Darkness, Joel Schumacher's Phantom of the Opera came along. And the competition just kept coming and just kept coming and just kept coming. And Blade Trinity topped out at 52 million in the US in the end. And outside of the US, 79.5 million for a total gross, $131 million. And so that was about 25 million down on Blade 2. It had also cost $65 million to make this one, so it hadn't been a frugal production. And by way of comparison, Blade 2 had cost $50 million, and the original Blade film, that was a bargain, that was 45. They'd all grossed roughly in and around the same, but Blade Trinity was supposed to build on things, and in fact, it didn't really. It was in the aftermath of that people started to open up a little bit more on it. David Goyer would give a subsequent interview where he said it was the most personally and professionally difficult and painful thing I've ever been through. And he's been very open about the fact that he's not a fan of the final cut of the film. There is an alternative ending around for it as well. But Goyer does say, I had very fond memories of working with Ryan Reynolds and Jessica Biel and a lot of people on the movie. He said, Ryan and I remain really good friends today. It was a challenge shoot, as has been reported. What can I say? Now, Wesley Snipes should note legalities took hold that a year or two after the release of Blade Trinity, Snipes sued for $5 million in damages in a US district court in Los Angeles. Now, he alleged violation of his Blade Trinity contract and said that he basically alleged that he didn't choose the director or the screenplay and the supporting cast, and they were basically forced on him. He also said he was owed a portion of his fee from the film. He alleged that he was harassed and defamed because of his race. New Line didn't comment on that, although Snipes' agents would in turn take legal action against him for a slice of their fee. All allegations, I've got no idea quite how all of these turned out, but it was a very messy case of afters where Blade Trinity was concerned. And it was also a period of, it was changing times for comic book movies as well. It was the bit where Marvel was waking up and becoming self-aware and sentient, really, and wanting more and more to own its own properties. I mean, I've talked in a previous episode of Film Stories about the Iron Man story and how in 2008 Marvel took the plunge, really, but that took a lot of building to. In the case of Blade Trinity, I mean, it arrived in 2004 and there were no plans for Blade 4 afterwards. There was a TV series that followed called Blade the Series, but now, at the point this is being recorded, we're in October 2022, Marvel has the rights back to Blade movies, but it's having a few problems of its own, just trying to get one off the ground. That just before, weeks before the movie was start to shoot, it lost its director, and so at the time I'm recording, Marvel has just delayed the release date of the film, and also as a result, a domino effect on a whole other bunch of films have also been pushed back. Mahershala Ali is set to take on the role of the Oscar-winning Mahershala Ali is set to take on the role of Blade in the new movie. A director hasn't been hired at the point this has been recorded, but it's unlikely Wesley Snipes is going to be returning to the franchise, although there has been some talk that he may or may not be involved. I should also acknowledge there was talk at one stage of doing a crossover between Blade and Underworld. That kind of petered out as well. And in the end, I mean, it's easy to forget just how strong the first two Blade films were and just what an impact they had at a point where getting R-rated movies of this ilk into cinemas was quite difficult. Blade Trinity kind of ended it all on a sour note, really. The hope is whatever Marvel comes up with for its next movie, it kind of lifts it and reignites the franchise. For now, Blade Trinity, it's not an outright disaster. It's just notably down on the films before, and it's quite telling that the story of the making of the film has become more prominent, really, than the film. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. And as always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. I'm just going to do some parish notices before I get on to the second half of this episode. So if you like this podcast, there are three things you can do to support it, and I really appreciate any stroke all of these. If you really like it and can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Simon Brew, you get in return an ad-free version of this podcast. You get the episodes early. You find out the gossip of what we've got upcoming as well, and also, as Patreons know, a couple of audio bits have dropped recently that aren't going to be around for a while. If you can subscribe to this podcast, that helps enormously as well. And if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, stuff like that is absolute gold dust to independent podcasts such as this one. I also have Film Stories and Film Junior magazines for sale at store.filmstories.co.uk. And if you want to come and listen to me waffle on live, my next live show at the point this has been recorded is in Birmingham in the UK at the Midlands Arts Centre on November the 2nd. That will be my Movie Geek live show. I'll be announcing one or two new London shows fairly shortly as well. But without further ado, I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories, and this one goes just a little bit spooky. Let me take you back to 1992. I'm going to play you a clip. We'll come to the story the other side of this.
Have you ever heard of Candyman? If you look in the mirror, you say his name 5 times.
In cities everywhere,
Candyman.
they whisper his name.
Right. Candyman.
It's just a story.
Candyman.
Candyman.
Just a ghost story.
Candyman.
An entire community starts attributing the daily horrors of their lives to a mythical figure.
The legend first appeared in 1890. He was attacked, mutilated, and burned to death. Poor Candyman.
Helen, a woman died in there. Leave it.
Everyone knows he isn't real.
That's modern oral folklore.
Everyone. Except Helen Lyle.
Bernadette. It ain't safe around here. That don't scare too.
So what you've got there is a taste of the trailer for 1992's Candyman, directed by Bernard Rose, who also wrote the screenplay for this one. It's based on the short story The Forbidden by Clive Barker and stars Virginia Madsen, Tony Todd, Xander Berkeley and Casey Lemons. And so I'm going to start with Clive Barker, the British author, a brilliant British author, a horror legend really. And he'd already seen his work hit the big screen at this stage with the Hellraiser movies. He brought Pinhead to the screen. We have to go all the way back to 1987 for that, a movie that he wrote and directed. He'd been filmmaking for a while. He'd done Salami, he'd done the Forbidden, he'd written Rawhead Rex, but Hellraiser was really the one that broke him through. Nightbreed in 1990 he wrote and directed as well. There are 2 computer games came off that. But Candyman was a short story as part of his anthology The Book of Blood, and one of the stories in there was The Forbidden, and that was the one that Bernard Rose would ultimately zero in on for his film. And so Rose had become familiar with Clive Barker's work when he was pursued to direct a different adaptation of a story from Books of Blood. One of the other stories in there is called In the Flesh, and that was the one that Rose was sounded out about. But he opted in the end not to do that, and instead he was drawn to The Forbidden. Now, Rose at this stage he'd enjoyed some success with the terrific, really chilling horror movie Paper House. That's really really put the shivers up me, that one. And that was in 1988. And in fact, he'd find himself in America for 1990's Chicago Joe and the Showgirl, working for an American studio there. And it was around this time he approached Barker for the rights to the story of The Forbidden and duly got them. And so he set about writing a screenplay for the film, but also he had this Chicago Joe and the Showgirl project that was in and around Chicago. It starred Kiefer Sutherland and Emily Lloyd. And what Rose had noticed was basically the state of the city of Chicago's housing projects. He cited several times the prejudice he witnessed in the area and the architecture of the place. And so while Clive Barker had originally set his story in his native Liverpool, what Bernard Rose started to think was, no, I'm going to move this to America. I'm going to move it to Chicago. And as Rose reflected to NME, he said going to Chicago was a kind of slightly random thing. He said, I went there to scout it, take a look around, and he said, the stuff I saw and experienced in Chicago, it was genuinely shocking. I mean, he was zeroing in really on the social deprivation, and in particular, he settled on the Caprini Green housing project in the city. And he describes that project. He said the Illinois Film Commission wouldn't go in there without an armed escort of police officers when he was trying to scout it all out. And he said their frightened approach really was, it only showed to him and demonstrated how fear of the streets was kind of an institutional thing. As he reflected, are we like scared of poor people here? And so he wrote the story with a Chicago base to it, and he wanted to tap into what he was seeing, to the social deprivation, to the discrimination, and to the fear that authorities had of the area. And so as he continued to evolve this story, what he knew by moving, and what he really strongly felt by moving the film to Chicago, was he couldn't just have the Candyman character, this horror, who's gone on to be a horror icon, be played by just a white middle-aged actor. It just wouldn't work. And he knew he wanted and needed an African-American actor for the role. He couldn't cast just another white guy in the midst of the film he was intending to make, especially considering the themes he was looking to explore. And I mean, there's quite a lot of dialogue around race and criticism and praise for race, for the way Candyman handles race, that's out there online. And I'll touch on it a little bit later as well. What Bernard Rose was doing was he was meeting people. He was trying to get this right. But also it was around here that another story bubbled up in and around the movie. And that was, when it became clear he was looking for an African-American lead, a story bubbled up that Eddie Murphy was going to star in the film. Or at the very least, he was being talked about as a potential lead in the movie. So early 1990s Eddie Murphy was somewhat back towards career doldrums, really. He'd had his own directorial debut, the film Harlem Nights, just splutter. It just hadn't done much at all. Another 48 Hours, that hadn't done great guns. And Beverly Hills Cop 3, a project he was trying to get off the ground at that stage, well, that was just bumbling around too. Now, he would mark his latest comeback with Reginald Hudlin's film Boomerang, but at this stage his star was lower than it certainly had been, and certainly would be towards the end of the 1990s. And so it just felt that the casting of Eddie Murphy held some water. Thing is, just wasn't true. As Bernard Rose has insisted, it's just an urban legend about effectively the urban legend film. The urban legend has spawned an urban legend. And so Rose has insisted, and he would know, that it was never the case that Murphy was considered for the role of Candyman, and that he was never talked about. But it doesn't stop the fact that when you search online and try and research Candyman, Eddie Murphy's name just keeps coming up. Instead, it would be the actor Tony Todd who would come into frame for the role. And I had a chance to talk to Tony Todd about this once, and he described it as the film that changed. He described that the film that changed his life actually wasn't this one. It was getting a role in Oliver Stone's movie Platoon, the Oscar-winning Vietnam drama. And he said to me, that's the one where I had my MFA in acting and writing. He said I was bartending when that came along, and ever since then I've never had to pour another drink that wasn't mine. And so he was just slightly coming to fruition really, and his presence was getting known. And so he was on the radar of Bernard Rose, and he landed the role in the movie. Now, his co-star in the film is Virginia Madsen, but she wasn't the first choice here. And as she would talk, she's talked to the Horror News Network about this, and she said, I was actually very good friends with Bernard and his wife, Alexandra. And he said she's a wonderful actress who actually brought Clive Barker's short story The Forbidden to her husband. And as Madsen said, she thought this would be a great film and that he could direct her. So she was supposed to take the lead female role in the film of Helen, and Virginia Madsen was going to play the part that Casey Lemon ultimately takes on in the film until they made that character African American. And then at that stage, Madsen was out of the movie altogether. Now, what changed was just as filming was about to begin, Alexandra discovered that she was pregnant, and so could no longer take on the role of Helen in Candyman, as the film was now known. And she describes feeling awkward about it, but Madsen said she actually came over one day and said it would just kill me to see someone else play this role. You have to be the one who plays it. And so Madsen said, with her blessing, I took on the role. I really tried to work my butt off just to honour her. Now, it was in August 1991 that Variety, the trade paper Variety, was actively talking about the film coming together, costing around $8-9 million to make. Two reports, one said 8, one said 9, so let's cut the difference. But what was interesting about this was the money, even though this was a relatively low budget film, was coming from 3 different pots. So one was the independent studio Propaganda Films that had been enjoying a fair amount of joy itself. This was a company founded in the 1980s that became, at one stage, the biggest music video and advertising production company in the world. And, all sorts of filmmakers have come out of Propaganda Films, people like Spike Jonze, Antoine Fuqua, Gore Verbinski, Alex Proyas in there, Michael Bay. Lots and lots and lots of names. But it was building up. It's co-launched by a man called Steve Golin, who would be the producer on Candyman, and it was building up its film work as well. So Propaganda was going to put part of the money for the movie in. Now, some of the money also came from Europe, from Polygram Filmed Entertainment. It stumped up a bit of cash to cover the budget. But then the rest of it was covered by Columbia TriStar's home video department. So home video in the early 1990s, before things arrived on discs and streaming, well, horror was always a fairly dependable way of making a bit of money. If you could put together a low-budget horror film, issue it straight to video without the cost of a theatrical release, then the chance of you getting a return was pretty good. People tended to explore the horror section of the video shop, would find the low-budget stuff, would give it a try. And so what Columbia TriStar Home Video was doing was funding a bunch of productions, or at least putting a bit of money in, with a view of, wouldn't show them in cinemas, would put them straight on VHS, and that was really the rule that it worked to. And to this stage, at the point it was signing its deal in 1991, it had never released one of these films that it had picked theatrically. That was about to change, however. Still, let's go to the shoot, because filming began on Candyman. A modestly budgeted film, shooting on location in Chicago, although with some interior work done on sound stages in Los Angeles. But it began filming in November 1991. And a lot of the stories to do with Candyman are to do with the bees. So if you have not seen the film and you do not like bees, I don't quite know how to prepare you for it, short of to say it is a film with a lot of bees in it, and not in a comedic Nicolas Cage remake of The Wicker Man kind of way. So there is a scene in the movie that involves Tony Todd having to put bees in his mouth, about a couple of hundred bees in there. And so obviously what they didn't want is Tony Todd's character to get stung to death. That would have been quite bad. And so what they had to do was basically breed batches of bees that didn't sting within the first 48 hours of their life. And so those were the ones that the animal wranglers came up with. There was no CG on this. It's really important to note. And so they came up also with a special device for Tony Todd's mouth that could be utilised and hold a couple of hundred bees. And then they had to bring in what was described as a low suction bee vacuum. It's the first time I've used that phrase on this podcast. I don't know if there'll be another. And between takes of this particular sequence, and I'm going fairly spoiler light on this, they used the low suction bee vacuum, that's the second time, just to gather them together so Tony Todd could basically breathe out. And so the crucial thing here is the bees were real. And Virginia Madsen talked about this as well. And she said, when Bernard Rose was first asking me to do the role, I just said, I can't, I'm allergic to bees. And he was like, you're not allergic to bees, you're just afraid of them. And so what she said is she then had to go to UCLA in the US and get tested, because Rose just didn't believe she was allergic to them, not in a nasty way. But Madsen said she was tested for every kind of venom, and it turns out she was far more allergic to wasps in the end than bees. And so Rose just said, we'll just have paramedics there, it'll be fine. And as Madsen laughed to the Horror News Network, actors will do anything for a paycheck. And she was just like, all right then, I'll be covered with bees. And so, to her delight, she was not one of those who got stung by the bees in the end. She was absolutely fine there. Tony Todd, he got stung quite a lot of times as it happened, but still, filming could wrap up relatively safely at the end of December 1991. So as Rose got to started working on his cut of the film, Dan Ray came in to edit this one. There was a bit of a coup here in that acclaimed musician Philip Glass was lured in to write the score for the film. And it didn't seem the most obvious job that he would take on at the time. And in fact, as he would say, he just didn't love the movie in the end. It was Rolling Stone that reported what he'd presumed would be an artful version of Clive Barker's short story, The Forbidden, had ended up, in his view, a low-budget slasher. However, there was quite a nice coda for Philip Glass for this, because sales of the Candyman score that he put together, it's a brilliant score, have continued to sell. And I think as the checks kept coming in, Philip Glass's animosity towards the actual film, and it wasn't nasty animosity, he just didn't like it. Let's just say it softened somewhat. Now, as it went into post-production and the cut that Rose was putting together was seen, well, there was displeasure. And this is where Steve Golin of Propaganda Films comes back into our story, because he made no attempt whatsoever to hide the fact that he wasn't happy with the movie. It wasn't a film that he was particularly invested in, apart from financially from the start. And as Bernard Rose explained to Fangoria magazine, he said Golin had really, really low expectations for it. And when he saw it, I think it's not an exaggeration to say he, quote, actively disliked it. But there was still some rumblings of this might actually be a bit more than the straight-to-video that many had assumed. But it wasn't until August 1992 that we got the confirmation that Candyman, surprisingly, was going to get a full theatrical release. Now, the obvious distribution partner for the movie, once it became clear that the film was good enough to put out in cinemas, was Sony. That Sony had fairly recently at this stage acquired Columbia Pictures and TriStar Pictures, and so it had a distribution arm. It picked those up off Coca-Cola. But the rights that it had were not for theatrical distribution. It only had home video. And so the theatrical rights to Candyman were suddenly out in the open. What gave Columbia TriStar Home Video the head start on this, though, was because it was an investor, it had managed to see Candyman before other distributors. And so while there was a little bit of toing and froing over who would ultimately get the distribution rights for a theatrical release for the movie, it was Sony and Columbia TriStar that ultimately emerged. It would go out under the TriStar Pictures label in the end. And it was announced in the summer of 1992 that the film was now going to open on over 1,000 screens in the US that October. It's worth noting, I mean, we're in an era at this point, at the point this podcast is being recorded, where low-budget horror routinely seems to hoover up tens, hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. That was absolutely not the case in the early 1990s. There was no expectation that this would go on to be a monster hit or anything like that. It's just like, this could make a welcome few quid. That would then bolster its profile going to home video, and everyone's sort of happy. And so a cinema release date was earmarked. I mean, the film debuted actually at the Toronto International Film Festival on September the 11th, 1992, and would head into US cinemas on October the 16th, 1992. I should add in as well, at the point TriStar picked up the distribution rights, Bernard Rose had a conversation with Steve Golin and said, what do you think of the movie now? Do you still not like it? And Golin was just like, no, it's a great movie, or it is now, because the financing at that point was secured. This had a chance to make a bit of money. So the response to Candyman, I mean, horror, again, like comic book movies, never tends to get much in the way of strong critical response, but Candyman really did. It got some really smart reviews, and people were tapping into the subtext of what Bernard Rose was trying to get at in the film, even though some were just not happy with it at all. There was a feeling that it worked on two levels. It worked as a horror, it worked to some degree as a social commentary as well. And so there was controversy over its depiction of racism and racial stereotypes, and Rose did push back against this, but there have been conversations, and I do urge you to seek those out just to get a more nuanced view than I can put across on this podcast. But for the purposes of the here and now, Candyman went into cinemas, and this $8-9 million movie, well, it actually enjoyed a decent opening weekend. $5.4 million in the US was not bad change at all. It opened in fourth place. The other openers that weekend were Consenting Adults, which came out, an erotic thriller that came out from Disney, because where else would you go for your erotic thrillers? The Public Eye with Joe Pesci opened up as well. That was in 10th place. The number one movie was Steven Seagal cooking up a bit of grub and then murdering people in Under Siege. Michael Mann's The Last of the Mohicans was in second place. The Mighty Ducks, released in the UK's Champions originally, fact fans, that was in third. But Candyman had done respectable business, and it had a 2-week run into Halloween. So by the time it was in its second week, TriStar added a couple of hundred screens. By the time it was into its third week, it was holding its screen count as well. And by the time Candyman then left US cinemas in the end, it had done $25 million of business on the big screen. And I haven't got the overseas number, but it had done a little bit of change as well. And it would indeed go on to be a successful video release. And in fact, the legacy of Candyman has lived on, as we're about to come to. So Golin then moved in and asked Bernard Rose to make a sequel. And as Rose explained to Fangoria, I made a deal with him to write and direct a Candyman 2. He said they were paying a good amount of money that more than compensated for the deferred payment that he had to take for the first film, which incidentally hadn't been paid for at the point this conversation was taking place. But Rose also had an eye on a bigger project. He was really keen to get off the ground. His Beethoven story, Immortal Beloved, but he was committed to Candyman 2, and so he started to come up with where he felt the story should go, because this wasn't going to draw directly on a Clive Barker story. But Rose explained to Fangoria, he said, I started to think about who was really the first boogeyman. And he said by boogeyman, he meant a shadowy figure that will come out of the dark and just kill you mercilessly and mutilate you. And he settled on Jack the Ripper, and suddenly he had this idea for where he felt the film should go. And so he entitled his idea Candyman 2, The Midnight Meat Train. And the central plan was that Jack the Ripper murders would start happening again. And he said, whereas the first Candyman was about race, the idea was to make the second Candyman about gender. And he described it. He said it was to be about the idea of this faceless, brutal killer who only attacked women in a horrific sexual manner. And that was the story that he was putting together. So a couple of problems, but the fundamental one at the point for executives when he handed the script in was Candyman 2, the Midnight Meat Train, had no Candyman in. And executives were baffled. Candyman 2 without Candyman. It would be fair to say this didn't go down particularly well, and Steve Golin instantly said no, not doing that. And also, Steve Golin wanted Candyman 2 within a year. This was horror. You can turn that stuff around in a year, can't you? Well, Bernard Rose wasn't going to do that, and he had the opportunity to get Immortal Beloved moving at that stage, and so that was the opportunity that he jumped at. Still, Golin wanted his sequel, and so Candyman 2 would press ahead, but it would not be with Rose behind the camera. The job went to an upcoming filmmaker by the name of Bill Condon. Now, you might know Bill Condon more recently from films like Disney's high-budget remake of Beauty and the Beast. He's done Dreamgirls. He did a couple of the Twilight movies, and I've had him as a guest on this podcast as well. A really fascinating man, and also someone for all the success that he's enjoyed. I mean, he's won an Oscar. Has never been shy about his horror, his love of horror, and his early work. I mean, he wrote the film FX2, and I'm coming to the FX films at some point on this podcast in the future. So Bill Condon took on the job for Candyman Farewell to the Flesh, but no doubt to the disappointment of Steve Golin, that still took 3 years to make. And there was then a third Candyman movie, 1999's Candyman Day of the Dead. And whilst the second one hadn't done great guns, it had done a little bit of money. The third one was the one that basically drove a stake through the heart of the franchise. Until more recent times, that a couple of years ago, Nia DaCosta was behind the camera for a modern day remake, reimagining, update of Candyman that did fairly decent business, really. It came out in 2021. It got mixed reviews, but produced by Jordan Peele. There was an awful lot of up and down on it, and it got some people really went for it. It made a decent amount of money as well, taking 77 million at the global box office. But the original Candyman, I would suggest, is the one that lasts. It's the one that keeps getting disc reissues. It's the one that keeps getting talked about. And incredibly, at the point this podcast is being recorded, it is 30 years old as well. And even 30 years on, after the first time, loads of people saw it on video. I'd suggest more people saw it on video than on the big screen. There's still some reticence about saying his name 5 times. Candyman? 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 Nah. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening, thank you for your time, and thank you for letting me bore you to death. If I've not completely bored you, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Our website, newly updated, it's gone a bit posher, filmstories.co.uk. That's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews and features. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you'll find all of our print magazines and our Sneakers Blu-ray for those of you in the UK as well. We made one of those here with new extra features as well. Facebook.com/filmstoriesonline or at youtube.com/filmstories, and a couple of other podcasts just to bring to your attention. The Film Quiz podcast, which I executive produce, hosted by Nick Helm with Hugh Davis. That is available now as well. And I'm also hosting the Studio Canal official podcast. A new episode of that is just landing at the point this episode is landing. That's confusing. All about French New Wave. So I've gone really, really posh, and you can find those wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, I'm going to go off and watch another bunch of films. The most important thing is you all look after yourselves. You all take care, and I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Bye-bye.